and thanks for visiting our website, rebuilderinabox.com. Today we're going to be rebuilding the ever popular 5MT starter. What this unit is going to fit is GM's 3.8 liter, commonly found in Buick, Oldsmobile, and it'd be this starter from the year 1986 on up and through the middle 90s. However, there is a newer version of the 5MT, and Delco calls it the SD255, which occurs from 96 to 2000 on GM trucks and some cars that have a 2.2 motor. The major difference between the two is the size of the copper stud on the solenoid post. The older version has the 3/8 larger copper post for the battery stud. The newer version, the late model, has the smaller metric size post. The thing that Delco and the manufacturers did for these starters, though, is some vehicles have the SD 210 260 series and some vehicles have the SD 255, which is actually a 5MT throwback. So you need to identify before ordering which one your vehicle has on it, because there's no way to tell with the application guides, even at the dealerships. As you might guess from this shot here, the units interchange as a unit, but for the rebuild kits, they're two different kits. So we need to identify if you have the 5MT version, which is called an SD255, or the plain SD260 210. The other thing is, even if the starter has been replaced prior to your ownership, the parts store will inadvertently sell either one. So the only way to tell really is to crawl under there and take a look. And the quickest way is to look at the solenoid, the way the solenoid's bolted on. If it has this round clamp thing and a smaller diameter, then you have the SD210, SD260 version, whereas this is kind of what Delco would consider a throwback, because it was going back to an older style of manufacturing. But this is the 5MT version, which is known as the SD255. First thing we need to do to tear the 5MT apart is to remove the solenoid. There's usually a 5/16 on the back, and factory, these bolts that hold the legs of the solenoid on were 5/16, but if it's been rebuilt before, you could find just about anything. You have to roll the solenoid in a rotating fashion to get it off, because there's a retaining lip that sits down behind the housing. So you have to roll it sideways and then pull it off. Then take the spring off. Then remove the two through bolts with the 5/16 head on the back. Oftentimes the one will have a hanger bolt, and you're going to need a 5/16 deep well or a 5/16 wrench. As we were talking about before, Delco threw a couple different parts into the mix. This one actually is the 5MT starter, but was being used interchangeably with the SD housing. So if you have this type of starter where you can see the springs like that, you'll need to watch the SD part of the movie in order to service that area. For the most part though, most 5MTs will be like this. The springs are a V on the outside, and the plastic brush holder rides in a groove on upper and lower guides. So we took the back plate off. Just pull the housing off. And pull the armature out. Put the armature in the vise kind of lightly. Take the first piece off, the lid, if it didn't fall off already. Then tap down on the outside of the retainer ring. And get the snap ring off. And there's the cup. Here's a close-up look of those three pieces. This is called the snap ring retainer, which is actually a hollow cup. It's open on one side, closed on the other. This side goes down towards the Bendix, and the snap ring itself fits down inside there. Then the lid there's a part on it that's raised up towards the middle. The outside's flat. That goes towards the dry vent housing, the nose cone, and this will click down into there when you're done. Here's a close-up look at one of the brushes. We're going to take a 3/16 socket and just take the screw out. And here's the brush. It goes on either way. You can put either side up inside the plastic brush holder. And just screw it back together and make sure it's tight. And you do that with all four brushes. All it really is this groove right here rides inside that guide. So we want to put all four of them in and make sure that there's no hang-ups. Sometimes you could even put a drop of oil on that. But make sure that after you put new brushes in that you got nice travel. Looking at the two hot brushes, you'll notice there's one long lead and one short lead. The short lead just goes right over to the guide right beside it. But the long lead has to go underneath this set of guides because the ground brush goes next to it so that you have a ground hot ground. So what you have to make sure and do is put this wire, the lead to the long hot brush, behind the field lead down inside. It doesn't lay on top of it. It goes underneath and gets tucked in behind it. It gets tucked in behind this field lead right here. Like that. Then we're going to load two of the brushes, doesn't matter which two, with our brush holder tools. There's one that's loaded right here. All it is make sure you got good travel on there, and you can bend this to where it's set to the right size. Just push it on there so it retains the brush temporarily so you can get it back together. What we're going to do is put 2 of them on there, either 2 that you want to, and then when we go to put together, we'll hold the other 2 with our fingers. It's just too hard to hold all 4 all at once. The 2 T25 screws on the sides of the housing need to be removed here and here. Then remove the metal brush holder assembly. Here's what new brushes look like. We're going to be taking a close look at the length from here to here. The wire goes into the back, so the length where the wear actually occurs is in this length. These brushes are 15 millimeters from the back to the front. So if the brushes that you're working with are over 75% there, even 75% there, we really don't recommend replacement because of the labor intensiveness of the replacement, and we'll show you how to solder new brushes in. But if you still have 75% of your brushes, we don't recommend replacement because this is not a high failure piece. Believe it or not, the brushes on a lot of these will last years and years, and if they're broken a little bit or if only 25% of them is gone, it's actually a better thing to reuse them than to replace them and cause yourself problems. But as part of the kit, we're going to send you a refurbished brush holder assembly, which is the ground brushes will already be soldered onto it. What you have to do to prepare to install this is to grind or sand or buff so that you have perfectly clean metal, this area right here on both sides, and the underside of the screw that bolts the brush holder in. Then you want to apply a thin layer of either dielectric or white lithium grease to these areas. Also, on the inside of the housing, it would be a good idea to very thoroughly clean this area right here so that the brush holder can get a very efficient ground. Take a buffing wheel or some sandpaper or a grinding wheel and clean that area so that you got fresh metal, and then put a smear of dielectric or white lithium grease there on both sides. Here's what the new hot brush looks like when it comes, and you can see it installed in this area right here. What you want to do is get a pair of wire cutters and use them as a prying tool to unroll this portion from around the actual existing copper field lead. So you get them back in behind like that and down in behind them and unroll it on both sides. Then after you apply a little bit of heat to the middle area, it comes right off. Here's the field lead sticking up that the brushes have been removed from, and we're just going to push that back down on there, crimp these shut, and then melt some solder down in it. And when you solder these in, the short side, if you're looking straight in at the lead, goes to the right. The long side goes to the left. The field lead itself is something that has to be paid very close attention to. If the wires are starting to fray severely in this area right here,
where the spot weld is starting to come off of the eyelet, then it has to be not used. And also the eyelet should be taken and paid close attention to with a piece of sandpaper, clean it up on both sides, and put a light coating of white lithium grease on it. When you start putting the ground brush holder back in, notice the path of the long hot brush. It tucks in behind this, and it goes underneath where the screw goes through right here. Then we're going to put both ground screws back in and make sure that we tighten them up very efficiently. This is a T25, by the way. You'll notice that we've included two 10MT ground brush holders in the kit, and they didn't come out. What these are is these are tools to hold the brushes back in place for assembly. And the way that works is, looking at this brush right here, we're going to load it and then shove that down on it so that it saves back out of the way and we can get the commutator up through there. What we're going to do is we'll just do two of them. You can do any two you want. We usually do the two that are opposite of each other, so that the tools are holding two brushes, and then you can hold the other two brushes with your fingers as you slide it back down over the armature. One preliminary to assembly test that you might want to perform, we do it here in the shop, is before we go ahead and shove the housing on the armature, we'll make sure, particularly on this type of starter, that the field circuit is not grounded anywhere to the block, to the frame. And the way you can do that is you can hook up a set of jumper cables to your battery, put the hot side here, and touch it real quick with the ground side on the frame, and you shouldn't get any spark. You should be able to have the hot lead on the jumper going to your battery hooked up to the hot lead, and then take your ground cable and rub it on there, and you should not get any sparks. It should be completely dead like that. Now there's two things that you have to remember when you're performing this test. Number one is, if you're on a steel bench, you have to have a rag sitting on the bench. And the other thing is, when you have a hot lead hooked up to the field lead, these two brushes become hot. So if they're touching ground anywhere, they're going to cause the arcing to occur. Most commonly, if you are getting a ground at that point, there are two common places for grounds to occur. The first place is right here. If this part of the hot field gets up against the case anywhere, that's going to ground out. So you can see where we've taken a piece of mylar, which you could use a piece of thin cardboard, and shoved it back in there so that there's something in between the hot part of this field lead and the case. Same thing on the opposite side. The field lead, the hot lead comes in here, and right on the inside in this area right here is an uninsulated area. So if that touches the case anywhere, it's going to cause a ground to happen. So we've put this thin insulator in behind there so that if that gets up against it, it can almost contact it, but it won't short out. What we're going to do here is take a close look at the bars on an armature. And this will help you diagnose whether the armature that you want to rebuild is in fact an armature that is rebuildable. We kind of have a little pun on words here. We call it the tail, and what it does, it tells you a tale of whether your armature is any good or not. This arc right here, that is what we call the tail, because there's an arc that is behind the brush as the brush passes over the bar. First of all, looking at the bars, you want a nice, clean, thin looking bar. If they get to be thicker than that, the copper's wearing down and it's about to wear through and it's not reusable. But you can see what you're going to look for is the same type of arc all the way around. Every bar should have a similar and equal arc. Here's another example. You can see the arc right in that area right here. And these brushes weren't laying perfectly flat, so there's no contact area here, but the contact area is from here to here and from here down. But you can see the arc, the tail of the arc on the bars right there. And so what we're looking at here is an armature that would be good to rebuild, because all the arcs are equal and even. There, there. But if you're inspecting the bars and then all of a sudden you come across one like this, where it's got more arc, or it's different from the other ones, then that's what we call a dead bar, because it's open. As the brush went across that bar, it had excessive current coming into that bar and caused more arc than the other ones. So an armature like that, where the one bar has more arc on it than the other ones, is considered not reusable. You can't rebuild a dead bar. Okay, we've already cleaned the armature, cleaned the commutator with Scotch-Brite or some fine sandpaper, and cleaned the shaft up, polished it up real good. We're going to put it in the vise, put a couple drops of oil on the shaft, then put the Bendix on, make sure you got good travel, and here's how you put the retainers on. First the cup goes on with the open end up, the snap ring retainer. Then we're going to set the snap ring itself on top of the shaft. Take a plain 7/16 socket, set it on top, and tap it on there, just so it's barely started. Then we open up a set of vice grips, a set of channel locks, to the size of the shaft, set it on there, and tap it right down in. You can tighten that up so it fits snugly as possible if you want to. Then we're going to take the channel locks, open them up about this distance right here. Push the snap ring all the way over to one side. Then that side that you just put over, take the channel locks and pry up on it so that it snaps in on one side. Then turn it around and finish rolling it in. If it doesn't want to cooperate, you can do this all the way around. Then put the lid on it with the convex part down into the cup. Put put some wet lithium grease on the shaft to hold the retainers on for later assembly. Now we need to change the fork in the nose cone and do some work on the nose cone. The fork is always bad in these. Even if they're 9 months to a year old, you have to change the clutch arm fork, the thing that throws the Bendix out. So first we have to get the pin out. Some of them will have just a snap ring here, and if you have a pair of snap ring pliers that are that small, that'd be nice. Otherwise you can just push it over to one side so you can get behind it and get something to pry it out with. It's not a real strong snap ring. Sometimes you can get inside the hole and pick it out, or just get a screwdriver behind it and pry it. But anyway, get that out and destroy it if you have to, because we're going to be putting a new one on there anyway. The pin comes out, and then the fork, which is the part that we have to replace. This is called the fork. So what we're going to do is, and if any of you have ever done the old-fashioned high torques and low torques, it's the same thing. Put the fork in the vise, get a pair of channel locks, and get on one side of it and bend it over. Then this comes out. Here's a little bit better view of it, and this is the new fork in the vise already. We're going to show you how to put the plunger into that, which is the same way you took it out. Just bend it over a little bit, stick the roll pin back in there, and then squeeze it back shut again. Try and make sure that these are still as straight as possible. If there's any kind of rust or corrosion, put a drop of oil down inside this area right here, because that rotates on there. This has to spin and have some lubrication down in there, but just a couple drops will do. What you might run into sometimes, Delco, in their infinite wisdom, sometimes I think they do this stuff on purpose. This is that pin that we just showed you how to get out with the snap ring and everything. Some of them don't have a snap ring on them. There's just, it's like a rivet that's been mashed out on the other side. So we have to take a chisel and chisel that off, and it takes some work to do that. But if you end up destroying it, it doesn't matter, because that's going to be replaced with a new pin and a snap ring anyway. You just chisel from one side, get it to bend over, then chisel from the top, or spin it around and keep on chiseling it off until you get enough out of the way to where you can take a center punch or something and drive it out. Now we need to get the bushing out of the drive-in housing. What we're going to do is just take a center punch and center punch as close to the very middle of it as we can. Then drill it out with a 1/4 inch drill, then drill it out with a 1/2 inch drill. If you have a drill press, you can just drill it out with a 1/2 inch drill. We usually use here in the shop, we'll usually use a 1/4 inch and then a 1/2 inch, just to make sure that it's as close to the center as possible. Then you get a 1/4 inch by 6 inch extension, put it down inside the hole, and hit the top of the extension with a hammer to drive the bushing on. We're going to send you 2 different bushings, the fatter OD and the thinner OD. The thicker OD is the one that's going to be used in case you have a needle bearing in there, and the thinner one will replace the bushing. So we're getting ready to put the new bushing in. Just set the bushing in there. And get it setting as straight as possible. Then we're going to use
a 3/8 extension. As we go to put this thing together here, you'll notice the fork has a cross member on one side of it. As you put this together, you slide that over there so that it goes into the grooves. Then that's going to go down because the nose is going to be tightened in the vise, and that cross member has to go towards the drive end of the housing, the Bendix. There's a close-up of the cross member sides and then the open side. So after you tighten the nose in the vise, as we're going to show you, that'll be the open side of the fork will be facing up towards you. Okay, getting ready to put this thing back together. These two knobs where the fork goes in, that's a friction area with the Bendix. So we're going to put a little bit of lubrication on that. Then, as I said before, the open end up goes on to the Bendix. Then set it down in there. At this point, we're going to put the pin through the hole and pull up and push down and up on the plunger to make sure that we have free travel. Then we're ready to put the housing on. The two brushes are already loaded. Then we're going to load the other two and hold them with our fingers. Just set it right down on there like that. And take the two brush holder tools out. This is what a new armature looks like. We're looking at this area right here, the brake on top of the commutator, which is actually built into the armature itself. This distance from the bottom, or the top of the copper, to the bottom of the end plate, or the top of this brake washer, is about 3 millimeters. A lot of times, by the time the starter is worn enough to be rebuilt, the brake washer itself has been worn off. So we're going to put a leather spacer on there to compensate. If you get too much, if you're over 3 millimeters, they will break in, but you do that by running it, and you'll smell the brake washer, the leather, burning up, but it doesn't really cause any problems. Smoke will come out of it, and it'll make an awful smell, but it's not really anything to worry about. We just need to get the starter to be able to free run. Put the snap ring back on the pin. It goes on pretty easily, so that you can use something pointy and just get it on one side at a time and then push it down on. But double check it from the side view to make sure that it's pushed on all the way and is down into the groove where it belongs. For a lot of cases, we would recommend reusing the bushing that's in the rear plate. The way you test it is, put it on there and wiggle it back and forth. If that's all the play you get, like this, then put some lithium grease in there and reuse it. If it's the needle bearing style, then definitely reuse it. Wash it up, put a couple drops of oil in there, and put some white lithium grease in there. If you do decide you want to change the bushing in the end plate, get yourself a center punch and grind it off like this. A flat side and just a plain bevel on the end. Secure the end plate tightly in a vise. Then use the chisel to make a line straight down the side of the bushing.
It's a very thin bushing. So what we've done is just chiseled away the material in a straight line, straight down, as shown is where it's marked. Then you can, if you need to, flip it around and do the same thing on the other side, and the bushing will just fall out. Now we're going to just set the bushing in place and tap it down in with the 3/8 extension. After it's all the way down in, put some white lithium grease in it. Then you have to go through a break-in period, which involves tapping the bushing down into the shaft, tap around on the outer edges of the end plate. Also, you can tap directly on the bushing. Until you can achieve a free spin. Then you have to put some white lithium grease in there. So we have the armature inside the field housing. We've set the field housing down on the armature. Line up the field lead with the plunger. Then we're ready to put the through bolts through the end plate and guide the through bolts down through the field housing to bolt up to the drive-in nose. The bolts go through both behind both ground brushes, there and there. If you're having trouble getting the through bolts started into the nose cone, you can take the nose cone back off and mark on the side where the threads are. Then you can split the housing off the nose cone a little bit, just so you can see the through bolt coming through, and that'll help you get started. Then just tighten up the through bolts with the 5/16, and we're done. We need to take a piece of sandpaper and clean up the field lead. Then we're going to grab the plunger, make sure that we still have good travel on the Bendix. Put the spring on. Solenoid rolls in. Put the two holders on. And then bolt up the field lead to the motor terminal on the solenoid. At this point, we're ready for a free run test. What we're going to do is lay the starter on the ground in front of a car or in front of a battery and hook up the jumper cables as shown, the ground one to the frame anywhere and the hot one to the big copper terminal on the solenoid. And what we're going to do to perform this test is to bridge with a small screwdriver from the S terminal, not the R terminal, from the S terminal to the hot cable. You have to hold your hand on it or put your foot on it because it's going to kick. For the first part of the test, we always do a series of short bursts. And what we're going to do is keeping all your fingers
and tools away from the open area. Do a series of short bursts and review the Bendix. What we want to look for is we want the Bendix to snap out and snap back very, very quickly. What we want to do is listen to the starter and make sure that it achieves a higher RPM like this. Now, if you've put new bushings in, you may have to go through a break-in period, which is also a series of short bursts, and you might have to run the starter on and off for 2 to 3 minutes. If you run the starter for 10 to 15 seconds straight, you need to do about a 30-second pause in between so that you don't cause any overheating. But if your starter seems to be running as fast as this one and has basically the same tone, sometimes there can be a little bit of noise because of the fork can vibrate on the Bendix, but it's nothing to worry about. If it runs nice and smooth like this one and sounds pretty similar to that one,